Some might envy the Gnolls for such a tangible connection to their creator god, but that envy would melt away to utter terror as soon as the beast's rotting breath and wicked cackles make their way through the dark of night. An excerpt from The Lords of Madness, Volume 4, Yanogu. Hi everyone, Jimmy, your local game master here, and like we did with kobolds, I'm here to dive into the history of Gnolls. I think maybe it would be best to establish the lore I will cover for them will largely focus on the Forgotten Realms, as this is where I personally draw a lot of my source material from. I'll also try to focus and figure out a structure for these creature dive videos, so it hopefully won't feel like I'm just rambling for each of the creatures over time, and hopefully I'll just get the information in a way out that's easy to follow. So let's dive into Gnolls. When I first dug into the history of Gnolls, they first really appeared in the Gygax and Arneson version of Dungeons & Dragons, and like many creatures they created, they're loosely based on some form of historical piece. In the case of Gnolls, the Gnoll was based on Lord Dunsany's Gnoll, which was the cross between a gnome and a troll. Now, as much as I love the concept of just what that would look like in general, that's not how a Gnoll really looks like in the Forgotten Realms, and generally what the consensus perception of what a Gnoll looks like to most people. So we can have some fun at the start of these videos, going over and just kind of getting to the point where we find what is the actual beginning of where these creatures kind of became what they were. I'll read the white box version of the Dungeons & Dragons Gnoll for you, and then we'll dive into the rest of the video and go over it. So to give credit where credit is due, the white box does describe the Gnoll as a cross between a gnome and a troll, even referencing Lord Dunsany's work. So it even references the historical aspect of the Gnoll. Although I will say they mention they don't know exactly what Lord Dunsany was intending for Gnolls to look like, and so this is kind of maybe an interpretation of that. For this reason, they actually also just applied the stats of the Hobgoblin to the Gnoll, which is similar to what they did with the Kobold, applying the Goblin stats to it. The Gnoll most people are familiar with is described first in the Dungeon Master's Rulebook, the Red Book. In this book, Gnolls are described as being low intelligence, resembling human-like hyenas. They use any weapons but dislike working whatsoever and prefer to steal and bully. And from that point on, the lore of the book describes Gnolls as being rumored to being a magical combination of trolls and gnomes. So less of a fact and more of a rumor. So much so that by the time we get to the advanced Dungeons & Dragons Monstrous Manual, they're no longer even going to say that it's rumored to being related to a troll and a gnome. It's just going to be the creature they describe as is. So I think from this point, this is kind of the best direction to go for Gnolls. And I do want to give a shout out to the Monstrous Manual for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. This book is a cornucopia of knowledge for creatures of Dungeons & Dragons, and by far gives the best explanations for these creatures that were originally appearing at this time. It has a ton of source material going into detail on their ecology in this book. So a Gnoll in Faerun is a chaotic evil creature that could stand anywhere between 7 to 7.5 feet tall. They were large, lean, bipedal human hyena hybrids. They weighed upwards to 300 pounds and had greenish-gray skin, but were coated with a combination of light and dark brown fur, similar to that of an actual coyote. Many Gnolls sported a crested mane that would raise up when they were angry. Throughout the editions, Gnolls had loose connections to demonic bloodlines that was represented in standout features between them, such as glowing red eyes, elongated talons, and flamed patched fur. Now, Gnolls weren't particularly well known for outliving other creatures. They had an extremely short lifespan, reaching maturity within a couple years of life and living to around 30 years of age. I think the oldest documented one's up to around 35. And while the reproduction of Gnolls isn't vastly expanded on, it's important to distinguish that male and female Gnolls were actually similar in appearance, almost indistinguishable until you kind of more closely examined them. And they were very similar in the manner of physique and capability in combat. Gnolls are well known for having somewhat changed in their lore throughout the editions of D&D, but regardless of the many depths we can kind of expand upon, Gnolls are best known as ferocious, demonically influenced pillagers and scavengers. A lot of what made a Gnoll different from many other of the humanoid races was their affinity to being a primal instinct hunter, often favoring the wilderness over a civilized area. It was written and believed by scholars of novels such as The Lords of Madness that a Gnoll couldn't lose the scent of a creature once it had picked it up. It was encouraged to burn your dead and cover the scent as best you can, praying to whatever gods you could that they chose not to pursue you. For gnolls truly were insatiable in their desire for obtaining what they considered to be their prey. Gnolls are objectively creatures that believe in the idea that demonstrations of strength were how you get things accomplished, choosing at young ages to be ferocious to even one another, engaging in lethal fighting just to assert oneself. Now, we get to a dividing course of gnolls where you could say that there are some gnolls that aren't necessarily chaotic evil, but the original logical tie used to explain having specific feelings like remorse is coming from Dragon Magazine issue 367, introducing gnolls as a playable race, with stating they would have a madness that would let them feel remorse for their actions. So for the sake of defining the most common depiction of gnolls, we'll stick to describing the more common chaotic evil gnolls. Now, many of these gnolls that had given into their inherent lust for blood ended up being nomadic packs of scavengers that would travel countrysides, raiding and decimating the lands they came across. In many cases, gnolls that raided villages would often kill off and consume all of the population they attacked, which could even include going as far as to digging up the corpses of the deceased to consume as well. Although this could also be necromancer propaganda, just want to throw that one out there. Because of their scavenging and raiding lifestyle, gnolls often didn't fashion or create their own weapons or equipment. It was often stolen and pillaged from others. On occasion, they would, however, take trophies from kills, ranging from bones of creatures to mundane objects. Many of these trophies would also further be used by gnoll trackers to keep the scent of prey that might have escaped so that they might pick it up at a later time. Despite the gruesome decimation that could be wrought by a gnoll attack on a village, they were often more or less uncommon due to infighting. Gnolls held strong familial bonds with those in their pack, respecting the idea of blood ties more than any other creature. Despite these shared familial bonds, gnolls valued strength and commonly fought amongst themselves for pack dominance. Regardless of the fights, it was understood the strongest was the leader, and the fierce loyalty of the bloodline meant more than a squabble for power. The real struggle for gnolls unifying and raiding was their lack of ability to unite well with other packs, often leading to familial raiding parties rather than multiple packs. While packs didn't inherently get along because they would constantly vie for whichever was the strongest, they were not unknown to take in individual separated gnolls from other packs and steer them towards their aims, eventually accepting outsider gnolls as family all the same. Gnoll societies would oftentimes be patriarchal, where the chieftain, oftentimes male gnoll, would have a harem of the strongest female gnolls as wives that would also serve as his honor guard of sorts. This wasn't all gnoll packs, mostly ones that would choose to settle down from the nomadic lifestyle. The more nomadic packs of gnolls would often focus more of their efforts on group collection of technologies and tools, oftentimes having to learn tricks of the trade and fashioning their own tools. But if the nomadic packs did come across some township, they would likely pillage and steal tools for use. Part of this lifestyle both the nomadic and settled gnolls had in common was they both detested the concept of physical labor. While oftentimes they would overrun towns and outright eat most of the survivors, those unfortunate enough to be taken as a prisoner were often subject to fates much worse than their immediate demise. Gnolls had neither the time nor the patience for creatures taken as slaves that wouldn't listen. For this reason, they appointed a pack slaver known as the Tantacarash, or Spirit Breaker, that would torture their slaves into compliance. If a slave would combat the training by the Tantacarash, they would simply be eaten. The unfortunate few that get completely broken in spirit are known as the Krishantel, the Savage Souls. For all intents and purposes, they pretty much would, if they were broken, would develop a Stockholm Syndrome to the gnolls, doing their bidding without concern. And while the gnolls weren't necessarily the brightest of creatures, they would use these broken savage souls to infiltrate other cities to get information on townships. To counter the savagery of the nomadic gnolls, some tribes differed, leaning away from the savagery and slaughter and embracing the thrill of hunting and trapping prey, advancing their technology through trade with other monsters like hobgoblins, ogres, and trolls. This is just to establish that not every single gnoll was out there just to eat villages and run away. Some of them were actually trying to settle down and do some trade. As we work our way from traditional packs or clan practices, we can talk about the couple different things Gnolls fundamentally did not hate, and those were hyenas and hyenodons. Hyenodons are just dire hyenas, and both of them were rather appreciated by Gnolls, serving as pets, mounts, or even guard animals. Gnolls had a certain affinity towards the creature they were a hybrid of. When we look at the fundamental concept of the human-hyena hybrid, we start to question maybe the origins of the Gnoll, and in the Forgotten Realms, the prospects of Gnolls were said to derive their roots from the demon lord Yeenoghu. Now, up until the most recent 2024 edition of Dungeons & Dragons, Gnolls were always considered humanoids. Now, the new monster manual clarifies their creature type as actually demons. This is most likely to shed light on their heritage to Yeenoghu. While very few Gnolls looked into other gods and beings to follow, majority pursued what best could be considered the teachings of Yeenoghu, which to a Gnoll wasn't necessarily practicing religious teachings or praying, but rather performing blood offerings in their conquest of other creatures, either through sacrificing creatures or what others might consider to be demonic rituals. The patron demon Yeenoghu would occasionally bless these offerings with a boon to a Gnoll that performed it, rebirthing the Gnoll as a Fang of Yeenoghu. This was a way to further encourage the repopulation of Gnolls on a given plane. As whenever a Fang of Yeenoghu would slay a creature, and a normal hyena would feast on the blood of the corpse, a dark ritual would be completed which would rebirth the hyena as an actual Gnoll through the blood sacrament. Now, there is technically a god of Gnolls I have not mentioned thus far, and that is largely because the way gods gain prevalence in the Forgotten Realms setting. It's roughly based on their worshippers and followers, and Yeenoghu, although a demon prince and not a god, held similar prominence to that of a god in the eyes of many Gnolls. The god of Gnolls, Gorelick, actually lost their prevalence to the demon prince over time, having been kept in prominence from packs of Gnolls in the plane of Shar. I do want to take some time to go over a couple of the different variant types of Gnolls and how they came about. We have mentioned the Fang of Yeenoghu, along with the Tantacurash. There's also the Flind, which is a shorter, stockier version of a Gnoll that was known for being a stronger leader that wielded a flail-like weapon called a Flindbar. While these Gnolls naturally fit into leadership positions, they would often end up as solitary hunters if they were ever found without that role. Weirdly enough, these Gnolls fell into an actual situation where if a Gnoll slew them, they would be transformed into a Flind, which served as an encouragement, I guess, to the Flind to always be the strongest. The next type of Gnoll is the Half Gnoll, which was a half-species born between a human and a Gnoll. I'll let you piece that together as to how that might happen given how Gnolls act. The last type we haven't talked about for Gnolls is the Witherling. Witherlings were created through another blood ritual where Yeenoghu would bless the bones of deceased Gnolls that were eaten by their own warbands. These Gnolls were revived back as skeletal Gnolls to travel along and fight along with their warband until their utter destruction eventually. I think Gnolls really encapsulate the meaning of vile, evil, chaotic creatures that an adventurer wouldn't feel much remorse for ridding them from the world. They're very fun creatures to run and roleplay as savagely, leaning into the idea that hyenas can mimic noise well, and using that as an aspect as a dungeon master to kind of mimic some stuff could be fun. So the next time you're running an encounter builder for your adventure, consider Gnolls as an option. Hey guys, thanks for taking the time to listen to the video on Gnolls. I'm the local game master, and I plan to do more of these videos covering other creatures from D&D. A lot of these choices have kind of been my personal picks of creatures I want to learn more about. On my page, I also have a video series about learning the most recent 2024 version of Dungeons & Dragons. If that's something you're interested, hit the subscribe button. Otherwise, thank you guys. Have a great day.